Well, good morning. Welcome to SACAC's summer webinar series. I am today's moderator, Christina Lopez. I'm also joined by Dave. He's in the background doing our technical support. So if you have any questions about technical issues you're having, please feel free to use the chat feature. We are so excited about today's topic. This is the first of our summer webinar series, and we are looking forward to an incredible panelist with a presentation. We also want to thank you for your flexibility. Due to an overwhelming response of members joining today's presentation, we did change the platform to make sure we could host everybody. So thank you for being flexible. And again, we are looking forward to an incredible presentation today. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will be taking Q&A questions. However, they will be answered at the very end of the presentation. But if you have a burning question that you want to get off your chest during the presentation, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to utilize that. Again, we won't be able to answer it during the presentation itself, but at the very end, we'll go in and I'll come back on and we will address these Q&As with the panelists if you have any. This session is also being recorded, so you are able to go back and watch it. And based on this topic, I'm sure we're all going to go back and watch it many times. So be sure to, if you are a SACAC member, we will be emailing you the link, and it'll also be housed on our membership portal as well. This is the first of quite a few summer series, so we're looking forward to sharing some more with you all. And again, welcome to today's presentation. The title is Why Allies Great Till They Gotta Be Great, Supporting Women of Color in Our Profession. I'm now going to turn it over to our three panelists today, and they will go ahead and get started. Again, feel free to use the Q&A tab during the presentation, and I'll pop back in at the end and we'll kind of rejoin to ask some questions with our panelists. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll take it over to our panelists now.
Morning, everybody. We are super excited to talk with you all a little bit today. We actually had this planned as a SACAC session for Jacksonville, and that did not happen. So we're super excited to be able to talk today. We really hope this is more of a conversation and a dialogue. We just want to share some things that we've experienced and things that have helped. And then we are really looking forward to answering any questions that you have. So we're just going to sort of do some brief introductions. I'm Brandi Smith. I'm one of the college advisors at Marietta High School, right outside of Atlanta. This is my 18th year in the profession, have been on both sides of the desk. So super excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Shannon Barrilleaux, and I work at an independent school in Metairie, Louisiana, which is just outside of New Orleans. I have been working in college counseling for 7 years, and I was in school counseling for 6 years before that. And I come to the profession from mental health. I am a licensed professional counselor prior to school counseling.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Armato. I am a college counselor and a DEI coordinator at a school in Miami, Florida, Palmer Trinity School. This is starting my 11th year working at Palmer, and previously I worked for 2 years in college admissions as well.
You want to go, Shannon?
Okay, so we're going to start with what does active allyship looks like, and the way we wanted to introduce this is to kind of compare the difference between performative allyship and authentic allyship. And I think that, you know, in having conversations, it really comes down to doing a lot of, you know, thinking about yourself and how you play a role in what you're trying to present. One of the things we talked about was centering yourself and what that looks like. And is it about you, or are you trying to make it about yourself, or is it about the issue that you're talking about? A term that I heard recently that I thought was really good was slacktivism, because it's really easy to kind of post and put yourself out there, especially on social media now. It's a lot more difficult to be an ally in real life and to speak up for those that you can. And then there's also an obsession with kind of being seen. And so you have to take inventory of the motivation behind your allyship. I think it's really a lot of people, a lot of companies are kind of adopting Black Lives Matter, and people are able to say that right now at this time after George Floyd's murder. But where were you, last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? And if you weren't able to say Black Lives Matter prior to this moment, why is that? Really think about that and do some work about what was preventing you from standing up for your colleagues of color prior to this moment. I think that it's easy to make mistakes when you're trying to learn how to be an ally and do social justice work. I think an example for myself in 2017 with the Women's March, I really jumped on board and I made a cute sign and I bought a pink hat and I marched and then I had to step back and really look at myself because I didn't realize what intersectionality and feminism meant, and that I wasn't really paying attention to my trans and non-binary friends and my women of color, people of color who didn't identify with this kind of pink hat movement. And I had to really do some research on what intersectionality and feminism meant. So I think it takes a lot of work on your part and not to burden your friends of color to do that work for you. There's plenty of resources for you to be able to figure out how to be a better ally.
I think in our profession, we are very conditioned to want to do what's right all the time. We're afraid to make mistakes. That's how we evaluate our students frequently, is, encouraging them to get good grades, 100% on something. And making mistakes is something that I think we all fear to do a lot. And I think those of us who are in education, I hope are always trying to do good. And a lot of our work is centered around validating other people for hard work and their good work. And the problem with using that same line of thinking when we're talking about allyship is that you're not doing it to center yourself in the work, and you're not doing it to, get a cookie for helping to dismantle systems that you've benefited from and that hurt others actively. And I think when thinking about allyship, think about divorcing yourself from the idea of doing good and waiting for others to tell you, you get it, you're great, awesome. It's not about you in that work. And I think in thinking a lot about, not that I'm trying to throw out MLK quotes right now, but just the idea of the white moderate liberal, that's a huge danger in thinking that you're doing well without really analyzing what it is that you're doing and checking yourself and thinking about your place and how you're trying not to center yourself in a lot of the work as well.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that they've said. I mean, I use the word performative allyship a lot just because I think, we've talked about this too, when you are a Black woman and you think about the term allyship, it hits a little differently. Obviously, I'm not the representative for all Black women, but I think sometimes when we hear the word ally, we do have a little bit of pause because we are so used to performative allyship, not necessarily used to authentic allyship. And what we really prefer is authentic. And I think most women of color in particular, especially in our profession, are looking for authentic allyship. And allyship is hard, right? I think for some people, even just the word ally is something that is even just a new term in the last few years for some people, and for other people just in the last month or so. And so we want to just dig a little bit deeper into what it means to actually do it authentically. Can we go to the next slide, Ashley? Okay, so before we get into the authentic side, I do want to sort of read this quote, which I think is really helpful for people. We have this listed on our resources at the end, but if you haven't read Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall, I highly, highly recommend it because it talks about the intersectionality of the feminism movement, right? Feminism was really started by women of color, and then as it evolved, it was sort of women of color were sort of left out of the conversation. And so this book really talks about why women of color sort of no longer feel included in the feminism movement and how we can sort of unite together as women. But to me, the last chapter is the best. It's called Allies, Anger, and Accomplices. And this is one quote that I think is hopefully will be helpful to people. It says, "Why is becoming an ally so hard? Many would-be allies have an immediate reaction of defensiveness when someone challenges them on their advice, their intentions, their need to be centered. It is in that precise moment that they need to stop, step back, and realize they are still part of the problem. It is never the privileged outsider who gets to decide when they're a good ally, especially not if they want to use their status as an ally to excuse whatever they have done that has offended someone in the group they claim to be supporting." Like, to me, that just like very succinctly sums it up. And I think that's part of the reason why allyship sometimes is hard, in particular for white women, because I think, and we even talked about this when we were preparing for this, even especially being in the South and what it means to be a white woman in the South, right? And you generally are people pleasers and you want everyone to feel comfortable, but like whiteness also teaches you that you have to be perfect at all times and that you can't get it wrong. And so even in the process of allyship, when you then get it wrong and someone's like, actually, like, let's think about this, then it's like, I want to go on the defense. And then that shuts down, further conversation. And so when we, think about authentic allyship, it's not about people necessarily seeing what you're doing. And I think that's where a lot of folks misstep when it comes to allyship. Like, people don't need a list of all the things that you've done or, how you've helped people. I always sort of compare it to, like, for many of us, how many of us are tired of reading like the mission trip essays, right? Like, I went to Costa Rica and I played soccer for a week with this kid and I like totally changed their lives. And like, well, chances are you probably actually didn't because you were just playing soccer for a week. But like, also like, why do you have to list all of those things? Like, it becomes more about you and less about like the experience, right? And so I think it's the same thing with authentic allyship. Like, to me, the most useful allies I've ever had are people who have never, ever once actually used the word that they're an ally. It's about sort of how they show up for people of color, how they show up for anybody who's othered in any way. So I always use the example of, and she's probably going to kill me, especially if she's on this right now. But my friend Christy Conley, she is a counselor right outside of Athens, Georgia. And I call her an ally all the time. She's like, stop saying that. Like, I'm not an ally. Like, I'm still trying to figure it out. She's really going to kill me because of that impersonation of her voice. But anyway, so what I told her is, you didn't actually have to tell me that you were an ally, Christy. I knew that you were an ally just from the minute I met you. When you talked about your students, you were always talking about all of your students, not just the highest achieving students, not just the wealthiest students. So that was already just an indication to me, like, okay, she's paying attention. But then she would talk to me about things like, I'm wondering, like, how come more schools don't offer AP computer science? And like, if they do, like, how come more Black and brown kids aren't in those classes? Like, there's got to be a reason behind it. Like, she was really thinking critically of the systems that she was a part of, not just going on like, oh, okay, like this is how it's always been. And so for me, like, that helped me to know that she was an ally, right? Even last summer, I was on dry run faculty, and Shannon's school hosted the faculty dinner for dry run, right? It's usually hosted at a school, and she's at a well-known independent school in New Orleans. And she could have very well just taken that opportunity to be like, I'm going to give you dinner. I'm going to only invite counselors from other independent schools. But instead, she made sure to not only invite counselors from other public and charter schools, but she made sure that there was also diverse representation of those counselors, right? And she and Sheena would always say, like, hey, if you're coming to visit my school, when you schedule a visit, like, don't forget about these other schools in the area. Like, that let me know, like, okay, you're an ally because you're thinking about things outside of what you have to think about. And I always use the example, our colonel who's over our ROTC program at school, the best way he talks about allies, which I think is pretty helpful, is he says, when he was in battle, and he would go to war, when he was with his battalion, it's like, great, these are people I trust. We've been through the same training. We have the same goal. He's like, but then when we were in battle and we were with allies, to an extent, we trusted them, but it took time for us to trust them because their interests were not always the same as our interests. And so if you think about that and how it relates to race, I think it's very similar. He said, for white people, it is also important to understand that trust as an ally is not going to automatically happen overnight. It's going to mean that you're going to have to keep showing up. You're going to mess up, but you keep showing up. Mess up, keep on showing up. That is how you build trust, particularly with people of color as an ally, because history teaches us as people of color that we shouldn't necessarily automatically trust you, because in the moments that we have trusted you, it hasn't always worked to our benefit. And so I think that's, important for people to understand that, like, if you're going to go into this trying to be like a truly authentic ally, like, you've got to educate yourself, like, you've got to be willing to, like, not take everything so personal, because oftentimes our experiences, in particular with white women, sometimes are just so traumatic for us. It takes a long time for us to trust. Do you want to add something, Ashley?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Brandi. I think many of you might have heard different language being used. I think a lot of folks are moving away from allyship and looking at the word accomplice because it's more of an action verb, and it also kind of implies that there's an additional risk in doing this work as well. Are you willing to give up a seat on a panel if it's not diverse enough and you want to make sure that more diverse voices are amplified? Are you willing to go, toe to toe with your head of school or your director to talk about representation? Can you give something up? And all of this is systems of power, and are you willing to give up to include? And a lot of times when inclusion feels like people are giving things up because those who have been given power systemically have to share it now, and then that can make people feel a certain type of way. So I think you have to also examine, if you're ready to do the work of being an active ally or authentic ally or an accomplice, is what are you willing to give up if this is work that you really believe in as well?
And when you're starting to think about things through an equity lens, it doesn't always have to be your colleagues of color that have to speak up and be at risk. You can go hard on the paint also, and often it's welcome because then your colleagues of color don't have to. And so the burden does not have to be, for issues for our students of color and for our colleagues of color, does not have to be put on those people.
Yeah. And I would sort of add, I think that's especially something to be mindful of as we go back into a new school year, whether it's virtually or it's in person. I think, it's important to know that for a lot of women of color, particularly a lot of Black women, we are literally exhausted talking about this. And it's because for us, we've been talking about this for years. For many of us, we've been screaming this from the rooftop for years. And while we're excited that people are beginning to wake up and like pay attention and want to talk about this, it's also not our job as women of color to explain all the time or to teach all the time. And so, like, sometimes it is helpful, like, if you're not sure, like, what to do, to just say, like, to the person, like, hey, how can I show up, or how can I support you best today, as opposed to just assuming. Because I'm going to be honest, it ebbs and flows, right? Like, there are times where, like, I'm like, the silence of white people is deafening. And then, like, literally 30 minutes, I could be like, white people, please stop taking up all this space. You're killing me, right? Like, it just ebbs and flows. And so I think, it's important to ask people how you can best show up and support them.
And I think as white people specifically, just being aware of the space that you're taking up and how often your voice is speaking up, and certainly not over, be aware of that in particular, but just speaking up in general or taking up space, like do an inventory of yourself in moments of allyship.
And to Brandi's point, we have been processing all of this in our silos, on camera kind of, but also in our homes and not in community. And there's going to be for students that I know we're concerned about, for our colleagues, if we end up going back to school in person, we're not just going to come back like everything is normal. And going back to normal isn't necessarily something we're all trying to strive for either. At the same time, we're going to have to think really strategically about how these conversations are introduced into our workplaces, into anti-racist education that we're trying to do, anti-bias training. And this isn't the work of people of color, and we need to step up in certain ways when we have seats at the table and we have the power to have those conversations, because like Brandi said, people are exhausted, and there needs to be a way that we take a burden off of people so that we can have these conversations and support them better. And I want to be really mindful about that and encourage you all to be mindful of that, going back into a school system where we haven't been together as one in a long time. That's going to look really different than it has in the past. So I would hope everyone's really cognizant of that as well.
And I think it's also important for white women to understand, like when we say that we're exhausted, I think sometimes white women internalize that as like, oh, they're just so exhausted of dealing with us as white people. You provide the majority of our exhaustion, but it's not just white women. I think sometimes one thing that white women don't think about is we're also having this dialogue amongst other people of color, right? Like, so I've had to have, like, over the last like week or so, some really difficult conversations with other women of color about how anti-Blackness can show up. And that sometimes is even a harder conversation to have than to have that conversation with white women, because, you know, sort of the unspoken rule for POC is that we always support each other, but that doesn't necessarily always happen, right? And so, like, how people show up, like Ashley and I talk a lot about, like, you know, what does anti-Blackness look like in the Latinx community? Like, what does that mean? And what are the struggles, right? Like, we talk about those things, and so we're also dealing with that on top of trying to help educate white women, on top of also trying to protect our Black men and our Black brothers and fathers. And so there are times where it just feels a lot. And I can tell you, over this last month, I have seen literally some of the strongest women of color break down in ways that I never imagined, because, like, it's finally just like all coming to the surface. And oftentimes as professionals, and especially in our profession, we oftentimes have to suppress a lot of the daily racial trauma that happens to us, because if we actually stop and think about it, it will live us insane. So that's just, I think, something to be mindful of.
I think somebody in the chat had mentioned, as a Black woman, Janessa Dunn had said she catches herself patting white colleagues on the back for their work. And I think, and I can't speak for all white women, but if that's your goal, then you're kind of going about it wrong. You can't expect people to give you cookies every time you do something good. And so I think that do those things and speak up, but don't expect always to be liked or given, you know, congratulations for doing what is right.
Yeah, and I will say, I do think what's hard about that is that oftentimes, like, women, when we think about like our role in the workplace, we generally, society, I'm not saying we necessarily believe that, but society generally puts us into two categories, right? We're either the nice, like, nurturer who wants everyone to get along, or we're the bitch, right? Like, those are like sort of the two extremes. I think the same thing in a slightly different version happens for Black women in a professional setting. It is either that, like, you get along, like you're a wife sympathizer, or like you're the angry, aggressive Black woman. And so I think it is a very fine line. And I think that while I agree with Shannon that, like, that it shouldn't be the goal to make white women feel better, like, you do, unfortunately, in our profession, if we're just honest about it, you do have to massage that in order to get things done and in order to not have a target on your back. For those of you who know me, you know I have no problem using my mouth. It generally gets me into trouble. But, like, I also recognize the privilege I have in being able to take heat for things that other people can't. But along with that has come me putting a target on my back. The things that people say to me publicly, privately, like, are incredibly awful sometimes. And I'm like, hey guys, just in case you, like, forgot, yes, I share my feelings, but I also am human, and I also have feelings. And so, you know, I would say, particularly for those who are newer in the profession, who are middle management in the profession, you do have to really, like, think strategically about picking your battles as a woman of color, because if you want to move up and you speak out, unfortunately, like, that could prevent some of your professional growth. And it really sucks that just because you're speaking your truth, and oftentimes the truth of other people, that it can sort of stunt your growth. I'm just an old dinosaur and I'm like, it's cool, like whatever. So I do think that's something important to keep in mind. Is that me? Sorry. Probably, yeah, great. Sorry, guys. I was looking at the question, sorry. So, you know, I think one thing too that's important to know is that when we talk about race, race and gender are also very intersectional. Oftentimes when we talk about race or we talk about gender or we talk about sexual orientation, people are talking about it in that one particular bubble, but we have to recognize when people show up, it's not just their race that shows up or not just their gender, their whole self shows up. And so I think it's, you know, important to keep that in mind. Intersectionality is a concept that we oftentimes don't think about when we're thinking about doing the work, but I think it's incredibly important to think about how people show up. So I remember a few years ago, there was an incident where someone felt like I was not being a good ally to the LGBTQ community because at the time, same-sex marriage was not legal. And they sort of said like, you should do something about this. Like, I need you to understand this is my Montgomery bus boycott. And I was like, pause. I was like, let's stop here because one, I don't want to play the oppression Olympics. It's not about like who has more oppression than the other, but like to compare the LGBTQ rights movement to the racial equality movement in this country, that's like literally comparing apples to pomegranates, right? Like the LGBT rights movement has moved at a much faster pace than the racial equality movement. And while I'm excited for my LGBTQ brothers and sisters, like to compare that is not fair, especially to those who are also people of color and LGBTQ. And what I explained to that person was when I show up, the first thing people see is my race, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. Before I open up my mouth, that is the first thing that they see. And there are assumptions that come along with that. For this person, when that person showed up, people didn't even know that person's sexual orientation. They just saw a white person. Very different things show up. And so it's important to really think about how gender sort of plays a role in that. You know, one of the reasons we talked about sort of doing this session is I think almost every woman of color I've come into contact with in our profession can name at least one white woman who in a professional setting, when they were challenged or they were questioned and they didn't know what to do, their first form of ammunition was to burst out into tears. And it's just like, oh, okay, we're here now. And like, regardless of what type of personality you have, nobody wants to make anybody cry, especially in an office setting. But what is really important to understand is that like when white women have been conditioned to do that, and sometimes it'll be like, well, I'm just emotional or I have a lot of things going on. But what a lot of white women I think sometimes don't understand is that when you cry, for many women of color, especially Black women, when you cry, that is you weaponizing your tears. And when you weaponize your tears, oh great, I'll let you do that, Shannon. When you weaponize your tears, that takes us to a really different place because the weaponizing of white female tears has oftentimes led to the death of Black people. So I'll let you take it from there, Shannon.
Yeah, I think that just in particular, when women, or white women, get emotional in conversations, it kind of derails and it turns the onus on the colleague of color to comfort you, and which is not fair. Especially if colleagues of color are trying to speak to you about like slights or microaggressions, they often might not, because their experience is that these conversations don't really go well and that they're risking, punishment or, by crying, they get in trouble and reprimanded. So when we use that kind of weaponizing of white tears, it's, you can hurt, but maybe step away and kind of, if you are getting emotional, take a minute and sit with that, think about what you're upset about, think about the message that you were given, and maybe come back to that conversation. And believe your colleagues of color when they tell you that you have hurt them or something that you have said, is offensive and they're in pain because that's their experience. no matter how you feel about it.
Ashley, you want to add anything?
I think just going back to intersectionality too, there's just, as women, we share a lot of things in common, and we, fight the patriarchy together. And there's a lot of misogyny that still exists and is still ramping, federally and everything. But we come into these spaces very, very, very different. And we've been conditioned to think in certain ways based on how we walk into places. I try to be very, very vocal about, identifying as Latina, but also being white presenting and white passing, and what privilege that affords me, how I can sit at certain tables and have certain conversations and be heard in a certain way that other people can't, because I don't wear my ethnic identity in the same way that other people don't have the choice to. So understanding when you do have a seat at that table, what privilege you do have to have these conversations. And I did see someone in one of the questions to the panelists talk about, how do you juggle between amplifying voices and then speaking for others? And I think there's not a right or wrong answer for how that is. I think if you're trying to do this authentically and in communications with people of color and women in color in particular about conversations that are happening at your school or in your place of work, you start to worry a little bit less about that part and worry more about the message and the work that needs to be done and making sure that people hear you. And a lot of times, sometimes they do need to hear it from you. For me in particular, walking into spaces, because of how I look, white women in particular will be very honest with me about their fears and what they think and their opinions. And there's this strange sense of, you'll see where I'm coming from because we look similar, and you'll see me as rational and you won't judge me in the same way. And that's not always true. But there's a lot of onus on me at that point to if I get to have that conversation, I'm going to educate, I'm going to challenge what you think. That's on me to help you process. If that's where I can do the work, that's something that I think I need to do. And I know not all women of color are a monolith, obviously, not all Latinas are, not all Black women, but at the same time, we need to be in solidarity about this kind of work. And I think that's something that we've seen come up a lot as we transition to the next slide, in talking about the Black in college admissions hashtag, and talking about the Black at hashtags that we've seen on Instagram and in social media about what people go through every day. And it's not just people suffering at the hands of white colleagues and white faculty and white students. It's also people of color doing it to one another too. So there's ways that we all need to be checking ourselves and the experiences of everybody constantly if we're doing this work the right way.
If we can go to the next slide, we're going to try to get through these next few slides because we want to get to more of the questions. Just one thing too that I think is important to touch on is that it's also important to know that, like, when it comes to like being an ally, one thing that I think stops people is this, when they're called out for actually tone policing, and that makes people feel really uncomfortable. I think especially as women, we are taught to like make people feel comfortable, right? Like to be nurturers. And so I think one important process to understand is that if you are working to truly be a good ally, you can't always be so obsessed with who the messenger is or how the message is delivered. You need to be more like concerned with the content of the message, right? I think sometimes we get so caught up in like who's saying it, why they're saying it, the tone in which they're saying it. And it's like, that is really, that's just the extra noise. That doesn't really matter. What matters is the content. And if you're more focused on who's saying it or how they said it, as opposed to what they are saying, then you generally are missing the point. And so I think that's really important to consider.
For sure.
I think sometimes a lot of people's reaction when they're called out or called in is that they didn't mean it that way. And I find that white people sometimes come to other white people's defense and, oh, I'm sure she didn't mean it that way. And it's really important to remember that, the impact matters more than the intent. And when someone is telling you how this impacted them, believe them, and really look at your defensiveness and what that means.
Yeah, because when you can't even get to the point of like understanding that is their experience. That is the true definition of gaslighting. And generally women of color are pretty adverse to gaslighting. And so that's important to keep in mind. If you guys haven't seen already, there is a group called The Table on Instagram. They have an Instagram page at The Table 360, where Black college admissions officers, Black college counselors are sharing anonymously some of their experiences. And so this is one that was shared that sort of sums up a lot of what is being said. So Shannon, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. Ashley, do you want to push the slide forward, or do we have a slide for that?
This is
I think
the
yeah, for me, I had a funny conversation with a friend, a Black colleague, recently about The Table, and they said, "Oh, well, they let you in?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Did they let me in because I'm white, or because?" And they said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "Well, yeah, they did." And I've read through every single post, and it's been really helpful to me. And I highly recommend it for white people to read through The Table, and then also Black at Instagram pages for your students' experiences. And when we talk about how do you support women of color in the profession, it is clear how they have not been supported or have been intentionally harmed by reading these pages. And then when we talk about when to speak up or take up space, I'm not sure it is a place to contribute your thoughts or your feelings about the post, but it's a great place to go read through all of them and see, you know, what's going on in our profession and how your colleagues are impacted.
Yeah, like one person actually commented, and I mean, and it's Instagram, right? So it's open to everybody. And so this younger white woman wrote, someone posted it and there were two spelling errors and she wanted to point those out. And so the response was, "Thank you for pointing that out. But also, like, let's recognize your privilege in being more concerned with grammar than the like painful experiences people are sharing with you." Like, it was just like, girl, like, come on. So, you know, like, that's just like one small example. So it's, I think it's a great opportunity for people to at least see what we can't always say in a public space, or we can't necessarily say to our colleague.
Yeah, and one more thing about that, I saw another question about how do you start doing this work, and you know, what are the steps? What's step one? I think that there's a lot of, you know, there are a lot of really great resources and books that we will mention at the end, reading and self-reflection, and what those books, you know, how they kind of walk you through some of those steps is really helpful. But I mean, start by looking at this Instagram and read them. These are your colleagues. These are your students. These are people that you know. You may have been someone who's caused some of that. Sit in your discomfort. What makes you uncomfortable about reading this? And think back if you see yourself in those. The work is hard. And I think just recognizing these really real stories, like, this isn't a hypothetical, these are things that have happened to people that you most likely know. So I think just starting with that and kind of sitting with that and thinking about your role in having witnessed and not said anything, your silence, and knowing that these things have happened, or if you had no idea that this was happening, that's a really good thing to unpack too, because if you haven't been paying attention, why is that? And what can you do to be more tuned into a lot of the trauma that people are still experiencing? There's stories on there from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and like yesterday. So this is an ongoing thing. So it's not a thing of the past. And to move forward, you know, you have to see it and you have to believe that it's happening too.
And I think too, when you think about like the first step, what I always recommend, particularly to white women, because I can only say so much, right? Like, I've never been a white woman, is that like, you have to find out who are the white women who are well respected by other people of color, right? Like, who are the white people who are showing up? Like I always think about, and I feel bad because I feel like I've exhausted her. Like, it's just like, I'm going to refer a white person to you, is Julie Kirk, who is now with Making Waves out in California. but like she is so great about like when she can see something going on social media, or she knows that like something is going down, she'll just like send me a text and she's like, tap me in, dog. I'm happy to have a conversation with that white person, or I'm happy to help them understand. And like, this is the thing, like two of the biggest allies that I know are Julie Kirk and Nancy Bean. Julie Kirk, y'all, is from Idaho. Nancy Bean is from East Tennessee. If they can get it, other people can get it, y'all. Like I firmly believe that. Like, they have come from environments where race was not something that you talked about. It was incredibly inappropriate to talk about, but they push you that. They taught themselves, they have experienced some trauma from race, and they have also really made an effort to be true. Like I wouldn't actually even call them allies. I would call them accomplices, because they recognize their privilege and they speak up and say things because they know that they have the power to say things and there not be so many repercussions, as opposed to a woman of color saying those things. So I would say, talk to other, especially if a Black person or a woman of color says, I'm exhausted, I can't talk to you. Like, are there some white women I can talk to? Like, go to them. They may be able to refer you, or there are other white women who can say like, hey, you should have a conversation with them. In no way does that mean that that person is perfect. No, none of us are perfect at this. And I think that's important to understand, whether you're a white woman, whether you're a woman of color. Like, I actually hate when we talk about cultural fluency, because like none of us are ever going to arrive. Like, this is constant evolving. This is constant learning. This is constant unlearning for all of us. And so it's important to sort of keep that in mind. There's some work out of SMU, one of their professors, they actually talk a lot about cultural humility. And I really like the idea of that, of like, I'm coming to you as I am, you are coming to me as you are, and we're having a conversation, right? Like we're meeting on a level playing field. It's not that I'm an expert or that you're an expert, it's that we're just trying to get to the work.
The big overarching question. I can start just from my experience. And I've had some conversations about this recently with a lot of friends as well, but I think I am probably very hard on other white presenting women in particular, because we know this, and there's a lot of colorism in our communities. And for those of you who aren't aware of that definition, it's within group and between group prejudice in favor of lighter skin color. We see this in our families. We see this in the messaging that we've received growing up. We might not have known what it was called, but we can all look back and think of times in which we saw that playing out. There's no reason when you turn on a telenovela on Univision or something that half of the leading ladies look like me. Like, I am not the representative of many Latina people in South America and Central America and Mexico, but that's what colorism is, and that's that preference for lighter skin tone and the privilege that comes, that's white privilege, and that's colonialism, and there's so much to unpack there. But I get very, very frustrated when white presenting women of color tend to take the easier path and the path of least resistance and try to go along with, systemic racism and white supremacy because it's easier and because it's what we've conditioned to think. And especially now, I really want to challenge anyone out there who identifies as that to really think about your role in this and to make sure that you're uplifting one another and other women of color and not being too afraid to do so. I think it's for some people, it's easy to not speak out and to try to go with whatever flow is in your offices or where you work, but I really need everybody to understand how that privilege can be used to uplift one another and not to cause further division. Because when we're divided like that, that's how we lose this, and that's how they win, and that's kind of what they want, if I'm being honest. So I really, really want to challenge people to think about how they can use what privileges they do have. And we all have privileges, and then we're all not privileged in other ways as well. But when we do have those privileges, please use them, and please be conscious of how you can.
And I think we're about to get to some questions, but real quick, I will say that listen for understanding and do your own work. When we came together to do this panel, the first thing I did was Google how to support women of color in in our profession or in the workplace. So you have the tools available to you to do the work and understand. Any question that you might have is easily accessible on the internet. So before you kind of pass it over or ask a colleague, do some work on your own. You'd be amazed at what's out there.
We're just going to run through these last two slides so we can get to the rest of your questions.
So these are some concrete ways to support women of color in our profession. I think a lot of what I read on the table was about how students of color were often shuffled to colleagues of color, and that multicultural recruitment was assigned to colleagues of color, and that white colleagues were easy to pass those students and positions off to your colleagues. And you should know how your institution supports students of color. You should be able to talk to those families just as well as your colleagues of color. And especially with events that are specifically with CBOs or with underrepresented populations, make sure you're supporting those colleagues as well, because they certainly show up for you at your events or at the school's events. Know when to be silent, I think, but also know when to speak up. But kind of do that inventory of, am I taking up space? Again, be aware of representation on panels, nominate people if you see a panel that they would be good for. You know, I find when I have admissions counselors visit my campus, I make sure to reach out to their directors and, you know, shout them out and say they did this awesome job. Make sure to partner with colleagues at other institutions if you have the privilege of working at an institution that supports you well. And then try not to perpetuate the ideals of professionalism, you know, and support your friends.
And I just want to say this real quick, because I feel like I need to say this for all the Black women. When it comes to like hairstyles, because this has happened more than one time, I get that like people are intrigued by Black hair, but please do not touch our hair. Like that, like to me, that's like equivalent to like when a woman is pregnant and people just automatically go and touch her belly. Like, unless you have been invited to do so, don't do that. Like, it feels like such a violation. And, you know, it's like, I think like every time I have to go through TSA in the airport when I have braids on, and it's like I get pulled over and then they want to go through my braids. It is a very invalidating experience. So like I get that like people are intrigued by Blackness sometimes and like what we bring to popular culture, but like just know, like if you touch somebody's hair, you might get those hands. Okay, that's it.
These are some resources that we put together before we go into questions. And I just wanted to clarify that the table Instagram account is open to non-BIPOC. It's open to everyone. So please join and learn and help us do that work.
The Facebook group, though, is only open to people of color, and you must answer the questions. We don't care if you're a VP. You got to answer the questions. I just want to clarify that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this book is really good too. In particular, the Dolly Chu. I just started reading it. I think it's incredibly helpful. She's a psychologist from NYU that I think can really help some people. You know, I will say the two books that are incredibly popular right now are White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist. Just a little bit of caution with those is that Robin DiAngelo, I think, does a great job in White Fragility, but I would recommend if you're going to read White Fragility, you should also read White Rage by Carol Anderson. She's a professor at Emory. There's a lot of overlap in how they see things, but there are also some notable differences because one is from the vantage point of a white woman, one is from the vantage point of a Black woman. And so I would say either read them side by side or read them back to back. I think it just gives you slightly different perspective. And How to Be an Anti-Racist is a great book, but it should not be your starting point. I think a lot of people are like, oh, great, like it's in one book, like I can just check off. No, it's not. And it actually can be dangerous if you haven't really done the foundation work, and you just go straight to How to Be an Anti-Racist. You can find yourself in some pretty sticky situations. So I would say, like, if you are interested in Kendi's work and you want to have a place to start, Stamped by him and Jason Reynolds is actually good. It's an easy read. It's really written for like high school level students. I would start there before I start with How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yeah, agreed. I also saw a really great article on Slate about reading Robin DiAngelo and also Ta-Nehisi Coates at the same time to get those kind of differing perspectives as well. And just, an aside, so you want to talk about race. That's a great primer book. It is so, how to start those conversations. And it might not be as helpful in terms of processing for people who are more advanced in the work and for people of color, but I think it helps to help you frame some of those conversations with other folks who are starting to do this work. So I think from a practitioner perspective, it's helpful in that sense.
Okay, we're gonna stop talking. Go, Christina. Sorry.
This is a great conversation. No, I understand. I will also note, I am a moderator, so I don't want to step on the presenter's toes, but I will also note with these resources, I would encourage everyone on this session to consider Black-owned bookstores for these resources for the books. This was mentioned actually in the Q&A, and I'm so glad that was brought up. So like Shannon mentioned, you can just Google Black-owned bookstores. It could be either online or maybe something local you can actually physically go to, but I would also encourage everyone today, if they're interested in purchasing books, to first utilize that as a resource. And that's my little side note there. But we have a lot of questions that came in, and I think this just speaks to the depth of this topic, which again, thank you very much for bringing this up. I think we need a part 2 and a part 3. So I won't be able to ask all the questions that came in given the time constraint that we're in. So I'm only gonna ask about 1 or 2, but hopefully looking through the Q&As that I see, a lot of them were answered throughout the presentation. So hopefully you were able to gain the information that you need, but we're happy to continue having this conversation. And I see a lot of things happening in the chat as well. If you're curious about the Instagram or the Facebook groups, we're kind of answering those live as well. So keep an eye on the chat if you're looking for some more resources. One question I wanted to ask, okay. As a white woman, I supervise Black women on my team, and our upper leadership are not supportive / understanding of BIPOC. What can I do to bridge the gap and support those on my team in times where they feel unsupported from the top down? It's kind of a heavy question, but any insight on that one?
I'm just thinking. I don't know if you guys have any other things you want to say first. So that is an incredibly hard question, because if there's not support from the top, then that means that the only support really is from you, which then does put some more pressure on you. Unfortunately, I would say that that's an opportunity for you to think about 2 things. One, how can you better support them, whether that's through individual conversations, whether that's through talking with them as a group, of asking them what their needs are, as opposed to just assuming what their needs are. But then the other part is, do you feel, even though you may feel like the upper leadership doesn't care, do you think that you can have the conversation with them to understand the importance of why they should care, especially given our current social climate? I think our current social climate has allowed us, I think we're in a different period than we've ever been in before, because we've been sitting here during a pandemic, watching the other pandemic of racism happening, and we can't get away from it. Like, I think that has allowed people who have always wanted to pretend like it wasn't an issue, like we can no longer pretend that it's not an issue. So I think we're at this very like pivotal fork in the road where people who weren't as apt to talk about it are now more open. So I would say perhaps this would be a great time for you to have that conversation with folks, because you want to think about sustainability for your office. You want to think not just about the diversity of your office, but diversity of the students that you are serving. And like, students want to see people who look like them. Like, everyone on your staff should be prepared to answer questions that students and families are going to have about like their safety on campus and what kind of support services are there for students of color. I'm amazed by the fact that like there's still so many admissions offices that have that one multicultural person who's expected to answer all those questions. Well, now we're at a point where like that can no longer fly. Everybody needs to be prepared to answer those questions. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know if you other ladies have some other helpful insight.
It's tough. I know. I was going to say, I just know I'm talking more from the independent high school side of things. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes leveraging what other schools are doing, because we're all kind of in competition sometimes for similar students. And it sometimes takes other schools to kind of move the needle to then show, hey, they're doing this over here. Why aren't we doing it at our school? And I know that we strategically plan, DEI coordinators at different institutions to see like, all right, like y'all are doing this. Okay, I'm going to bring this back and we're doing this. And kind of having those conversations with folks at other offices to see what's worked and then trying to kind of infiltrate it that way as well.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more and then we're going to wrap things up. I will also note that during our wrap up, we'll pull a slide up that does include Brandi, Shannon, and Ashley's email addresses. Not to bombard them because they're very busy, but if there are connections that need to be made, they were gracious enough to share their contact information. So we won't be able to get through the full Q&As, but thank you, Brandi and Shannon and Ashley for sharing your information, and we'll include that at the end. The last question I want to ask before we wrap things up is, how do you genuinely ask for a bi-POC's input and perspective on issues of diversity, inclusion, equity without tokenizing, especially in a majority white office with a few bi-POC staff members?
Can you repeat that question one more time, Christina?
Sure. How do you genuinely ask for a bi-POC's input? And I'm going to skip around a little bit, so I'm not reading the whole question, but how do you genuinely ask for a bi-POC's input and perspectives on issues like diversity, inclusion, equity without tokenizing them and while being in a majority white office?
Yeah, so I would say, once again, just ask, right? Like, I would ask them, like, is this a discussion you would prefer to have with just people of color, or would it be more helpful for us to have a diverse committee with people of color and white people to discuss those? Because depending on where that person of color is, they may not feel comfortable necessarily having that conversation around white people. Maybe it eventually will get to that, but I think you just ask. I mean, I think I'm always amazed sometimes by how much we spend on surveying and questioning and asking kids and tracking what their thoughts are, but we sometimes don't think to do the same thing for ourselves as professionals. It's like, you don't always necessarily have to assume or carry the burden of like, am I getting this right? Just ask, like, the people you're trying to serve, just ask. Like, when I really want to know what students are thinking, I just ask them, and they are incredibly honest about sharing their opinions. So I would say just ask the people of color in your office. I want to know, I'm asking you this because I want to know how I can also support you and also help us to think about whatever our institutional, goal is. And I think most people would be pretty perceptive to that. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts.
I mean, I think that you build trust with that colleague also. If you're supporting them consistently, then they're going to be more willing to have those conversations with you. Mm-hmm. And I know for me, in a school that has, very few Black faculty members, I advocate for compensation. If we're going to use our colleagues for DEI work, we do not have a DEI coordinator, but if you're going to have that conversation, then they should be compensated for their time and effort and investment.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with both of those, and just add that I think if you have never had a conversation with this, again, no one's a monolith. Everyone's going to respond differently depending on where they are that day. Everything changes. But if you've never had those questions with folks before, I think you need to lead with, I should have talked to you about this sooner. I think you need to also own that you probably should have engaged in these conversations earlier and owned that you're late to the conversation in that way. If you do have authentic relationships with folks, then they'll know that it is authentic and it's a genuine ask and concern.
Yeah. And I would say if you're on a college campus in particular, like reach out to like your sociology department or your psychology department to think about those interactions and how intersectionality shows up. I'm amazed by, like, we'll tap every other office on a college campus for help and resources, but like the sociologists are doing research, they're doing some great work that can sort of help tap in. You know, like I think of like Ted, I was talking about this on another webinar yesterday, like Dr. Ted Thornhill, who's at Florida Gulf Coast. He's actually done a lot of research on like admissions and how admissions officers interpret the name of students and the activities they're involved in and make conclusions about race and if that student is admissible or not. He's done some really interesting research. So like, work with those folks you have on your campuses. And then on the high school side, I would say, you know, talk to your social science departments and see like what kind of conversations are they having. Is that an opportunity for one of those teachers to come in and have a conversation with your college counseling office about like just interactions? And those conversations should be happening even if you don't have a person of color in your office. If you're an all-white college counseling office, that's probably even more of a reason why you should be having those conversations. So just keep that in mind.
Shannon, Brandi, and Ashley, whew, thank you all. This has been such an insightful conversation, and I think it kicked off the summer series extremely well. I mean, we set the bar pretty high for the rest of the summer, so thank you. We're going to pull up our wrap-up slide in a moment, which will, again, have the information for Shannon, Ashley, and Brandi, as well as kind of the next steps that we have for where this recording will be posted. Again, for all of our SACAC members that are joining us, you will see that on your membership portal. And so we can come back and watch this again and again and again, which I plan to do. So we are so thankful that you're here today to join us. I am so appreciative of Brandi, Shannon, and Ashley for being here today and taking the time out to really present on a topic that I think is extremely important now and going forward. And we absolutely look forward to seeing you at our next future webinars that we'll be hosting through the SACAC organization. So you all have a wonderful and safe remainder of this.
Everybody.
Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you at our next webinar.
Bye.
Bye.